the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. At 8:46 a.m. on Tuesday, September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Over the course of the next hour, 3 more attacks would occur. United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon outside of Washington, D.C., and United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. 2,977 people were killed that day, and more than 6,000 were injured. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in world history.
That day, panic unfolded across the country. Flights were grounded, parents pulled their kids out of school, and all professional sports events were canceled. Around the world, people were shocked, and Americans everywhere worried both for the safety of those they knew and about the future. Over the next several weeks, as the cleanup efforts began, the United States government began to take steps to fight global terrorism. The world learned that the attacks were carried out primarily by Saudi nationals angered by the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. These attackers were members of the group Al-Qaeda, which operated out of Afghanistan and was led by Osama bin Laden. The hyper-partisan politics of that time period seemed to pause as the United States saw a dramatic increase in patriotism. And quickly, the War on Terror, a phrase coined by then-President George W. Bush, became a global effort. 196 countries and jurisdictions expressed their support for the U.S., and NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history, providing a collective defense between the Cold War alliance of Western countries.
By the end of October 2001, the U.S. had launched a full-scale invasion into the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, and within 2 years, the War on Terror had spread to Iraq as well. Over the course of the ensuing 20 years, 2,461 American servicemen and women were killed in action in Afghanistan, with at least another 4,500 in Iraq. In all, more than 929,000 people worldwide have died in the post-9/11 wars due to direct war violence, including over 380,000 civilians. The repercussions of 9/11 have been passed down from one generation to the next, putting 20 years of lives on the line. Over the course of the last few months, the Taliban have retaken control of Afghanistan, as well as the democratically elected supported government that was supported by the U.S. Tens of thousands of Afghan refugees who have worked for the United States Army have been forced to flee the country. As we've heard from those coordinating last week from those coordinating the supply drive, around 1,000 are expected to find new homes here in St. Louis. Just last week, on August 30th, the United States removed its final troops from Afghanistan, ending the War on Terror 20 years after the initial invasion. In many ways, the 13 service members, many of whom were not even born at the time of the initial attacks, who were killed by the suicide bombing in Kabul on August 26th, were the final victims of 9/11.
Whether or not we've noticed it, we've felt the effects of 9/11 throughout our lifetimes. However, none of us students were alive when those planes were hijacked and crashed. For those who lived through September 2001, it was an event that connects them in shared grief. They remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. Members of the class of 2002, who were seniors at the time of the attacks, have offered to share their reflections and memories of the day, after which Mr. COCO will talk about his experience.
On 9/11, Mr. Rapley had us write down our thoughts and experiences from the day, and I actually still have that right here. And my primary emotion was just disbelief. We watched in Miss Hewitt's office in the library as a second plane hit the World Trade Center towers, and we saw the images on TV of the damage to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and it was hard to imagine just the horrible scenes that we were seeing on TV. And it was shocking just to think that an attack like that could happen on American soil.
I remember I was in the library. There was a TV, so the librarian saw it. We then went to math, and our math teacher had a son in the Pentagon. So she was trying to get a hold of him. She was out in the hallway. It was really sad and scary. And then I had a cousin that was up in the second building, and I was made aware of that from the bulletin board. They put a note up that we were waiting to hear from him, and then throughout the day I went back and forth and didn't hear anything until that night. He was the only one on his floor that survived. There were a lot of people that knew people in New York, were nervous for people in New York, and it just was one of those times that we're all never going to forget where we were.
As a senior at MICDS, I vividly remember being in English class with Mr. Dlugosh when we received word that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center, then a second plane. After rolling around a TV and tuning in to watch this breaking news, an all-school assembly was called in Danforth Chapel. While these tragic events changed history forever, I will always remember our entire school community coming together to be there for one another during this time of uncertainty.
It's a little crazy, but the thing I remember the most actually is the internet breaking. We were in Mr. Skinner's AP biology class, and we'd heard the rumors that a plane had hit the towers. At the time, people thought it was more of a personal plane, smaller one. No one knew that it was actually like a full-on commercial jet. And we were trying to get details, so we went online. I remember trying to go to CNN.com or New York Times, and literally all of the websites just had ceased to work. There were too many people in the country trying to all go to their websites and get their news at the same time.
I was sitting in AP/AB Calc in the old Matthews Hall in Mr. B's class. We were sitting there working on a problem, and he had the radio on. And, just kind of the normal morning radio, when all of a sudden one of the announcers says, "We're just getting reports that a plane has flown into the first tower of the World Trade Center." The high schoolers knew what was going on, but the rest of the school didn't. And I remember talking to my mom, because we can't get a hold of my dad. And she's, wanting us to come home. This is happening in New York. Could it happen in St. Louis? You just had no idea what was happening other than what you're hearing on the radio or seeing what you saw on TV, because you couldn't get a hold of anybody by phone. Again, it was a day that you knew life was going to change forever.
I was a senior at MICDS when 9/11 happened. And I remember vividly sitting in Mr. B's AP Calculus classroom, where first period he would often have the radio on. When we heard about the first plane, we thought it was kind of odd, but when the second airplane hit, we knew that we were under attack. The rest of the day, we were kind of in shock. And in addition to our concern for the families in New York and around the country, being about to turn 18 years old, our thoughts turned to, we might get drafted and we might have to go to war.
I had my first class in the morning, and I believe somebody came in at some point during the class, another teacher, to tell our teacher that something was happening, but we didn't know. We didn't know it was happening. We didn't get notified in that way. And then once class ended, everybody was really upset in the hallways, and we were, getting bits and pieces of information that something terrible had happened. And so we went to our second period, and there was a TV there. And so we just watched the news to try to get more information or whatever we could. Afterwards in the breezeway, it was just really sad and intense. There was a lot of people who, had friends and family in New York, or whose family was flying that day. And there was just so much uncertainty about what had happened, what was going to happen next, all these loved ones, what was going on with them. So, it was a really scary, intense day.
So I'm going to kind of talk about being a teacher back in that time, what happened that day. So it was a typical Tuesday. We had all of our 7 classes that day. We had the 45-minute classes like we typically do on a non-block day. School started at 8 a.m. Near the end of the first period, Ms. Helfont, who was a teacher next door to me, came over to inform me of the terrorist attacks. By that time, both towers and the Pentagon had been struck, and the fourth plane was still in flight. The first period ended, and the students left my room with very little knowledge of the terrorist attacks. As my second period chemistry students, who were sophomores, entered the room, they were already aware of what was going on and wanted to watch the news during class. Unfortunately, I did not have access to a TV, nor did I have a cable connection. However, I had a VCR connected to a projector. One of my students knew how to convert my VCR into a device that accepted analog TV signals. What he did is he took a paper clip, bent it into the shape of an L, stuck it in the back of the port of the VCR, and instantly we had coverage of the events. The first thing that some of my students began talking about is they did not know if their family and friends in New York City were alive and safe. At that time, very few students had cell phones. Then the conversation turned to our disbelief and our inability to understand how the terrorists had turned these commercial airplanes into destructive missiles. This concept was beyond our capability to understand, and anything we'd ever seen maybe in a movie or on TV. In addition, during our conversations, there was definitely no talk or any thought of the towers collapsing. As we watched the media coverage, the TV station continued to show the second plane hitting the South Tower over and over and over. At that time, there was no video of the first plane hitting the North Tower, nor there was any video of the plane hitting the Pentagon. Our conversation then turned to the fire spreading in the towers and how that was going to be very challenging for the firefighters to combat. The next horrific thing we saw live and in action was people jumping out of the towers. We saw a handful of people jumping to their deaths because the tower fires were overwhelming and there was no escape for them. At this sight, some of my students began to cry. Then, all of a sudden, again in live action, the first tower collapsed. My class erupted with disbelief. As I said earlier, we had no thought of that event occurring. Then as we continued to process this event, within the next 30 minutes, the second tower collapsed. Students who had family and friends in New York City really began worrying about their safety, and still they had no way to communicate with them. So during this 45 minutes, my second period chemistry class, we saw, in that 45-minute time, we saw the collapse, or we saw the striking of the second tower. We saw the people jumping out of the tower. We saw the site of the Pentagon, and we saw the two towers collapse. We were watching the loss of lives as they were occurring in real time. Within an hour, the head of school and the head of upper school called an assembly in the old Danforth Chapel. Stood right here. As I stood at the entrance of the Danforth Chapel and watched the students stream in to sit where they were assigned to, I heard some of them talking about going to war. Some of the male students were talking about getting drafted. I saw faculty and students crying, and I saw a look of disbelief from most individuals. I also heard some students talking about that they thought St. Louis was going to be attacked soon. And how would we protect ourselves at the school? Even with all the commercial airplanes on the ground at that time, there was fear that some type of car bombings would occur all over the St. Louis area and in the U.S. In addition, some students thought that there was going to be a terrorist army that would invade the U.S. All of these fears were legitimate because of the carnage we had just watched and because of the success of the terrorist attacks. You see, if the terrorists could bring down two of the largest structures in the U.S., the fear was that these terrorists could strike anywhere and that they could accomplish anything at any time. However, as adults began to speak during our assembly, they brought a sense of calm and logic to us all. As we began to process the events and the emotions and talk through everything that had happened, you could sense the student body starting to calm down. After the assembly, the students and teachers were dismissed back to class. The focus for the rest of the day went from academics and activities to helping each other cope with their emotions, to gather facts about the events, to try to make connections with family and friends both in St. Louis and in New York City, and to reassure the students that they were safe. I was very proud of how our community handled the day and showed tremendous care, support, and empathy. I'm a big believer in the concept that you truly don't see or know someone's character until significant adversity strikes. On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, everyone was witness to the incredible character the MICDS community possesses. Although you do not desire for events like this to occur in order to reveal our character, it was very comforting to know that this type of character was alive and strong at MICDS. Okay, so a moment of reflection. In fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to change it into a moment of action. I need you to get your cell phone out, please. Everybody in the classrooms also, please get your cell phone out. On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, almost 3,000 Americans lost their lives. At the beginning of that day, the victims of this horrific event did not know it would be their last day. Often we fail to acknowledge and appreciate our loved ones. So in this moment of action, I'm asking for great maturity from you. I'm asking for you to please to send one simple, sincere text to an individual whom you've not communicated your appreciation, recently. Please let them know how much they mean to you. You would now take the time to send that text. You have 1 minute to do so, please. Thank you for your time and attention. Juniors, you may rise.